Picture this: the scent of sizzling garlic and fresh-baked bread wafts through narrow, crowded streets as merchants shout over one another, hawking lentils, olives, and strange, spiced wines. This is Rome at its most alive, not the marble halls of emperors, but the chaotic, vibrant heart of everyday life. Yet, for all the grandeur we associate with the Roman Empire, the meals of ordinary people remain shrouded in mystery. What did they actually eat? No lavish feasts of stuffed peacocks or honeyed dormice. Those were for the elite. The real story lies in the humble pots, bubbling over hearth fires, in the simple staples that fueled an empire. Here's something that might surprise you. The Romans didn't have tomatoes. None of their famous sauces or stews featured this ingredient we now consider essential to Italian cooking. Instead, they relied on garlic, so much so that it was dubbed peasant's gold, a pungent staple that seasoned everything from beans to fish paste. And while the wealthy dined on exotic imports, the average Roman survived on grains, vegetables, and whatever they could afford at the market. Their diets were shaped by necessity, by trade routes stretching across the Mediterranean, and by beliefs about what foods kept the body strong. So how did a carpenter in Pompeii or a baker in Ostia fill their stomachs? What secrets hide in the ashes of ordinary kitchens buried for centuries? This isn't just about food, it's about survival, ingenuity, and the flavors that defined an era. We're peeling back layers of history to uncover the truth behind Roman meals. From the smoky porridge that started their days to the fermented fish, sauce they couldn't live without. By the end, you'll see ancient Rome not through the eyes of senators or gladiators, but through the hands of the people who kept the empire running one simple, sustaining bite at a time. If you walked into the home of an average Roman family at breakfast time, you'd likely find a pot of poles simmering over the fire, a thick, hearty porridge made from spelt or emmer wheat, sometimes livened up with a drizzle of honey or a handful of chopped vegetables. This wasn't just food, it was fuel for an empire. Grains like wheat, barley, and millet weren't merely ingredients, they were the scaffolding of daily life. Bread, baked in communal ovens or at home, was so essential that it even became a political tool. The government's grain dole, known as the annona, supplied free or subsidized wheat to citizens, a system that kept the urban poor fed and, crucially, kept them from revolting. But when shipments from Egypt or Sicily were delayed by storms or pirates, the streets of Rome turned restless. Hungry crowds didn't just grumble, they rioted, burning bakeries and storming granaries. Milling grain was backbreaking work, usually done with heavy stone querns that could take hours to produce enough flour for a family's bread. In wealthier households, enslaved workers shouldered this labor, but for most it fell to women and children, grinding grain before dawn to have bread ready by midday. And not all bread was equal. The wealthy enjoyed fine, white loaves, while the poor made do with darker, coarser bread often bulked out with cheaper grains like barley or even acorns in times of scarcity. The poet Juvenal mocked Rome's elites for turning up their noses at brown bread. But for millions, it was the difference between survival and starvation. What's fascinating is how deeply grain was woven into Roman identity. The word pulse gives us pulse, a term we still use for legumes and grains today, and the Latin panis for bread echoes in languages across Europe. Even Rome's military conquests were in part a quest for fertile grainlands Egypt's. Nile Valley became the empire's breadbasket. Its harvests shipped across the Mediterranean in vast cargo ships. So next time you slice a loaf or stir a pot of oatmeal, remember, you're touching a thread that stretches back to the smoky kitchens of ancient Rome. where every spoonful was a small victory against hunger. In the bustling streets of ancient Rome, bread wasn't just food. It was a social marker, a political statement, and sometimes even a health hazard. The wealthy flaunted their status with panis candidus, a fine white loaf made from carefully sifted flour, while the working class gnawed on panis plebeius, a dense, dark bread packed with bran and whatever grains were cheapest that season. But the differences went deeper than taste. Eating coarse bread wasn't just a matter of poverty, it carried a stigma. Roman writers like Pliny the Elder sneered at those who couldn't afford better, calling their bread fit only for dogs. Yet for many, even this rough loaf was a luxury. In years of bad harvests, desperate families stretched their flour with ground acorns or chickpeas, resulting in bread so hard it could crack teeth. Mold was another grim reality. Without modern preservatives, bread spoiled quickly, especially in Rome's humid climate. The poor often had no choice but to scrape off the green fuzz and eat what remained, a practice so common that satirists joked about it, though the risks were real. Rotten bread could cause dizziness, nausea, or worse. But here's where Rome's ingenuity shone. Bakers learned to mix in herbs like fennel or anise to mask the taste of decay. And some even resold stale loaves as twice-baked bread, a primitive version of biscotti that lasted longer on journeys or military campaigns. Bread's importance extended beyond the kitchen. Most Romans didn't have ovens at home, so neighborhoods relied on communal bakeries, where the scent of baking dough became a daily rhythm. These bakeries weren't just shops, they were hubs of gossip, heated debates, and even espionage. Bakers held immense power. Their guilds influenced grain prices, and sometimes even conspired with politicians to manipulate supplies. When Emperor Augustus first organized Rome's bakers into a formal collegium, it wasn't just about regulation, it was about control. A well-fed population was a docile one, and bread, as the poet Juvenal noted, was the glue holding the empire together. The next time you bite into a slice of sourdough or tear apart a baguette, think of the Roman baker sweating over a wood-fired oven, the child grinding grain before sunrise, or the politician scheming over a loaf. Bread fueled an empire, not just by filling bellies, but by weaving itself into the fabric of society, from the humblest meal to the highest halls of power. Olive oil wasn't just a cooking ingredient in ancient Rome, it was lifeblood. Imagine a world without butter or vegetable oil, where every kitchen revolved around a single, shimmering liquid. For the Romans, olive oil was as essential as bread, and just as symbolic of status. The finest oil, known as oleum flows, or flower of the oil, came from the first pressing of ripe olives, a golden green elixir so prized it was reserved for dressing delicate dishes or drizzling over fresh bread at wealthy tables. But for the poor, oil was darker, cloudier, often pressed from overripe fruit, or even recycled from the dregs of earlier batches, a bitter necessity rather than a luxury. Where grain fed the empire's stomach, olive oil fueled its engines. Beyond the kitchen, it lit homes in clay lamps, greased the wheels of chariots, and even soaked into the skin of athletes in the baths, scraped off with strigils after workouts. A single amphora of fine oil could cost as much as a month's wages for a laborer, yet even the poorest couldn't escape its grip. Soldiers received it as part of their rations, shipbuilders waterproofed hulls with it, and doctors prescribed it for everything from sore throats to wounds. The sheer versatility of olive oil made it indispensable. A jar in every pantry, whether humble or grand, the trade in oil shaped landscapes and fortunes. Vast estates in Hispania and North Africa were devoted entirely to olive groves, their harvests pressed and shipped across the Mediterranean in distinctive amphorae, stamped with the producer's mark. These clay vessels tell a story of globalization. Spanish oil flooding Roman markets, undercutting local growers and sparking trade disputes. Pliny the Elder grumbled about counterfeit oils, adulterated with herbs or cheaper fats. A reminder that food fraud is hardly a modern problem. For the urban poor, the oil dole became as critical as the grain dole, subsidized, or free oil, distributed to keep the peace in crowded tenements. Yet the true magic of olive oil lay in its ability to bridge worlds. In religious rituals, it anointed priests and sacred statues. In death, it preserved bodies for cremation or cleansed them for burial. And in the streets, the scent of frying oil from snack stalls, sizzling fish cakes, or honey-soaked pastries was as much a part of Rome's soundtrack as the clamor of the Forum. To taste first press, oil was to taste sunlight and soil, the labor of countless hands from grove to table. To rely on the dregs was a daily reminder of where you stood in the empire's unyielding hierarchy. Liquid gold indeed, but whose gold? That depended entirely on the coins in your purse. If you think ancient Romans sipped fine vintage from crystal goblets, think again the wine most people drank would make a modern sommelier cringe. For laborers, soldiers, and even children, wine wasn't a luxury. It was a daily necessity, so diluted it was practically tinted water. The rich might savor aged Falernian wine, but the working class guzzled posca, a sour, vinegary brew made from fermented grape skins left to sour in water. This wasn't about pleasure, it was survival. In a world where water sources were often contaminated, wine's acidity killed pathogens, making it safer to drink than straight water. Even slaves received a wine ration, not out of generosity, but to keep them alive and working. The stigma around drinking wine, undiluted, tells you everything about Roman priorities. Only barbarians, or the desperately poor, drank it neat. Philosophers like Seneca mocked those who couldn't handle their wine, while military manuals warned soldiers that undiluted wine led to sloppy discipline. A proper Roman mixed 1 part wine with 2 or 3 parts water, sometimes adding honey or spices to mask the taste of cheaper vintages. Posca, the soldier's staple, was essentially vinegar cut with water and herbs, a far cry from the elegant blends served at patrician banquets. Yet this acidic swill fueled Rome's legions as they marched across continents, its sharpness cutting through the dust of distant battlefields. Wine's role in society went beyond hydration. Taverns, smoky rooms lined with amphorae, were where politics and gossip collided. The wealthy sneered at these establishments as dens of vice, but for the poor, they were lifelines, places to trade news, borrow money, or forget a day's toil over a cheap cup. Meanwhile, the elite used wine as a status symbol, flaunting aged vintages from Campania or Greece, their labels as telling as the clothes they wore. But whether it was Posca in a clay cup or Falernian in silver, wine bound Rome together, a shared ritual from emperor to enslaved laborer, proving that even in a stratified society, some habits crossed every divide. And if you think modern happy hours are rowdy, just wait until you hear about the Bacchanalia scandals that shook Rome to its core. But that's a story for another time. Cabbage might seem like a humble vegetable today, but in ancient Rome it was practically worshipped. The statesman Cotto the Elder didn't just recommend it, he rhapsodized about its medicinal powers, claiming it could cure everything from headaches to ulcers. For ordinary Romans, cabbage was more than food. It was a survival tool. Cheap, hardy, and easy to grow even in small urban plots, it became a staple in every class's diet. The poor boiled it into soups or ate it raw with a dash of vinegar, while wealthier households might dress it with garum, the pungent fermented fish sauce that flavored half of Rome's dishes. But cabbage wasn't alone on the Roman table. Leeks, onions, and garlic were the holy trinity of everyday cooking, tossed into pots with lentils or beans to stretch meals further. Lentils in particular were the unsung heroes of the working class, protein-packed, affordable, and versatile. A simple lentil stew, seasoned with cumin and a scrap of salted pork if the budget allowed, could feed a family for days. Archaeologists have even found lentil residue in cooking pots from Pompeii, proof of how deeply this humble pulse was woven into daily life. The real genius of Roman vegetable cooking lay in its thrift. Nothing went to waste. Beet greens, turnip tops, and even wild weeds like mallow were boiled into broths or mashed with grain to make patini, a kind of ancient casserole. Wealthy gourmets like Apicius might scoff at such rustic fare, but for most people, these dishes were the difference between hunger and sustenance. Even the water used to boil vegetables wasn't poured out. It became the base for soups or a warm drink when money was too tight for wine. What's striking is how these simple ingredients transcended class. A senator might dine on exotic asparagus shipped from Gaul, but his cook still relied on the same cabbage and leeks simmering in a tenant farmer's pot. The difference: presentation. A rich man's lentils might be garnished with costly spices, while a laborer's were eaten straight from the bowl with a hunk of coarse bread. But beneath the garnish, the bones of the meal were the same proof that in a society obsessed with status, hunger was the great equalizer. So the next time you chop cabbage or stir a pot of lentils, remember, you're handling ingredients that outlasted an empire. These weren't just foods, they were lifelines, carrying generations through drought, war, and upheaval. And if Cotto was right about their healing powers, perhaps they carried something else too: the quiet resilience of ordinary people, turning simple things into sustenance. Meat was a rare luxury for most Romans, but they had a clever solution hiding in plain sight: legumes. Beans, lentils, and chickpeas weren't just fillers. They were the protein powerhouses of the ancient poor. While the wealthy indulged in roasted boar or thrush stuffed with figs, ordinary Romans turned to humbler ingredients, simmering them into stews that could stretch for days. Archaeologists sifting through the ashes of Pompeii have found carbonized lentils still clinging to the insides of cooking pots, silent witnesses to meals eaten in haste before the volcano's fury struck. These weren't just dietary staples. They were lifelines, packed with enough protein to fuel laborers, soldiers, and enslaved workers through brutal days. Chickpeas in particular were the unsung heroes of Roman kitchens. Ground into flour, they became flatbreads. Boiled with garlic and leeks, they transformed into hearty soups. Some vendors even roasted them with salt, selling them as street food, an ancient version of today's roasted nuts. And then there were fava beans, so ubiquitous that they became a symbol of the working class. The playwright Plautus joked about their ahem digestive effects, but no one could deny their staying power. A bowl of favas with a drizzle of olive oil and a sprinkle of salt could keep a plasterer or a porter going through hours of back-breaking work. The real secret to Roman legume cuisine: fermentation. They didn't just boil beans, they transformed them. Take garum, the infamous fish sauce that flavored everything from stews to desserts. Lesser known is its vegetarian cousin, liquamen, made from fermented lentils or peas. This pungent paste added depth to otherwise bland dishes, a trick borrowed from Greek and Egyptian cooks. Even the legionaries relied on it. Their marching rations often included a pouch of dried lentils or chickpeas, to be boiled with whatever wild greens they could forage. But legumes weren't just about survival, they shaped Roman identity. The word pulse, still used today for dried peas and beans, comes straight from the Latin pulse. And in a society obsessed with status, the humble bean was a silent equalizer. A senator might dine on peacock, but his slaves, and likely his ancestors, had been raised on the same lentil stews, now bubbling in tenement pots across the city. The difference was garnish, not substance. So the next time you toss chickpeas into a salad or ladle out a bowl of lentil soup, remember you're eating like a Roman. Not the feasting, toga-clad elite, but the forgotten millions who built aqueducts, tilled fields, and raised families one sturdy, unglamorous bite at a time. Their legacy isn't carved in marble, but etched into the very atoms of these unassuming seeds, tiny vessels of resilience that outlasted an empire. Cheese might not be the first thing you associate with ancient Rome, but for ordinary people, it was a rare pocket of protein in a world without refrigeration. While fresh milk spoiled quickly in the Mediterranean heat, cheese salted, aged, and preserved became a clever workaround. Most came from sheep or goats, animals that thrived on rocky hillsides where cows couldn't graze. The result, a sharp, tangy product, far removed from today's mild cheddars. Pliny the Elder raved about cheeses from the Alps or the island of Crete, but for the average Roman, even a crumbly, pungent wedge was a treat, grated over bread or stirred into stews for extra richness. Dairying was a small-scale affair, often managed by women on family farms. Imagine a shepherd's wife in Latium, pressing curds into woven baskets to drain, then salting them to last through the season. This wasn't industrial food, it was survival chemistry. Fresh cheese, called Cassius recens, was a fleeting luxury, eaten within days, but aged varieties like the smoky Cassius fumacis could travel for miles, traded at markets or carried by soldiers on campaign. Cheese even appeared in religious offerings, a humble counterpart to the grand sacrifices of wine and meat. The real surprise, how regional flavors became points of pride. Pliny noted the sharp Cassius helveticus from modern-day Switzerland, while Roman soldiers stationed in Gaul developed a taste for local creamy varieties. But for the urban poor, cheese was more utilitarian, a way to stretch meals. A handful of grated goat cheese could turn a bowl of lentils into something resembling feast food, at least in imagination. And here's the twist. The very scarcity of dairy made it precious. Without refrigeration, every bite carried the labor of herdsmen, the risk of spoilage, and the ingenuity of preservation. So next time you sprinkle Parmesan over pasta, think of the Roman laborer doing the same 2,000 years ago. The methods were cruder, the flavors wilder, but the impulse was identical: to transform the ordinary into something just a little richer, a little more sustaining. In a world where fresh milk was a fleeting privilege, cheese became a small, salty triumph. The smell of fish markets along Rome's coast would have hit you long before you saw them briny, pungent, alive with the shouts of merchants haggling over the morning's catch. In ports like Ostia or Neapolis, fresh seafood wasn't a luxury. It was a daily reality. Workers gulped down grilled sardines wrapped in vine leaves. Oyster vendors shucked shells right on the docks, and even the poor could afford a handful of tiny fried fish to toss into their stews. But travel just 50 miles inland, and the story changed dramatically. Without ice or speedy transport, fresh fish became a fantasy for most Romans. Instead, they relied on a far more potent ingredient, garum, the fermented fish sauce that seeped into nearly every dish, from peasant porridge to patrician feasts. Making garum wasn't for the faint of stomach. Picture layers of small fish anchovies, mackerel, sardines piled in clay vats with mountains of salt, left to rot under the sun for months. The resulting liquid, strained and bottled, was a culinary powerhouse. A single spoonful could transform bland grains or lentils into something complex and savory. a trick cooks still use today with soy sauce or fish sauce in Asian cuisine. But here's what's fascinating. Garam wasn't just a condiment. It was a social leveler. The wealthy drizzled expensive, first-press garam over delicacies, while the poor made do with the murky dregs, called liquemen, scraped from the bottom of the vats. Yet both depended on it. Archaeologists have found garam amphorae in every corner of the empire, from Britannia's damp barracks to Egypt's desert outposts. Inland, where fresh fish was a rarity, garam became a lifeline. Soldiers marching through Germania carried it in their kits. Farmers in Gaul stirred it into bean stews. Even Rome's famed mortem, a humble herbed cheese spread, got its kick from a splash of fermented fish. The sauce was so ubiquitous that satire writers joked about garam breath, and doctors prescribed it for ailments, believing its strong flavor could wake up sluggish digestion. But behind the laughter lay a stark truth. Garam's saltiness masked the taste of stale or spoiled ingredients, making it a practical tool for stretching meager supplies. The real divide between coast and inland wasn't just about freshness, it was about access. A dockworker in Pompeii might feast on mussels picked off the rocks, while a blacksmith in the Apennines savored the memory of fish through garam's briny tang. Yet both were bound by the same culinary thread. Whether you were spooning it from a clay cup or sipping it from a silver ladle, garam was the taste of Rome itself, an empire preserved in salt and fermentation, where even the humblest dish carried the echo of distant seas. For most Romans, meat was a fleeting luxury, not a daily staple. Pork and poultry occasionally appeared on working-class tables, perhaps a scrawny chicken stewed with herbs, or a handful of cured pork scraps tossed into a pot of beans. But beef, that was sacred, literally. Cattle were primarily beasts of burden, their value measured in ploughed fields rather than roasted haunches. When beef did appear, it was usually at public sacrifices, where the gods received the fatty entrails and citizens shared the rest, a rare windfall of protein for the poor. Juvenal, Rome's sharp-tongued satirist, captured this divide with biting wit. He mocked elites who gorged on whole boars glazed in honey, while the urban masses scraped by on stinking scraps from cheap taverns. One of his poems paints a grotesque scene. A wealthy host, parading an enormous lobster on a silver platter, passed guests who'd never tasted anything grander than a salted sardine. These weren't just jokes. They were indictments of a society where meat symbolized power. A senator's banquet might feature thrush stuffed with raisins, but a laborer's feast was more likely a sausage made from dubious leftovers organs, blood and grain fillers pressed into casing. Yet even these humble meats carried risks. Without refrigeration, spoilage was constant. Street vendors peddled dubious cuts to the desperate, prompting laws against selling putrid flesh near temples. Archaeologists have found butchery marks on animal bones in Pompeii's back. Ali's evidence of ad hoc carving where every tendon and scrap was utilized. The poet Martial snarked about a host serving rabbit, so old it hopped onto the plate by itself. A dark nod to foodborne illness. The real twist: some of Rome's most iconic meats were born of necessity. Take botulinum, an early ancestor of salami. Made from offal and heavily spiced to mask spoilage, it was the working man's preserved protein, smoked, salted, and hung to last through lean months. Soldiers carried similar smoked sausages on marches, a portable meal that required no cooking. Meanwhile, the wealthy turned preservation into art, aging hams in brine or fig juice until they achieved what Apicius called the perfume of the gods. What's striking isn't just the gap between rich and poor, but how meat became a language of aspiration. A freedman saving coins might splurge on a single grilled sausage to celebrate his child's birthday, mimicking in miniature the excesses of the elite. A tavern keeper's sign in Austria bragged of dormice stuffed with nuts, though the dish was likely cheap mice substitute. Meat wasn't merely food, it was theatre, a way to perform status even when the reality was gristle and bone. So when you picture Roman carnivorous feasts, remember, the famous banquets were exceptions, not the rule. For every peacock served in gilt sauce, 1,000 families subsisted on pulses and grains, their lives punctuated only occasionally by the rich, greasy luxury of meat, a taste of power that, however fleeting, made them feel, just for a moment, like citizens of an empire that fed its people well. Figs were the candy of ancient Rome, sticky, sweet, and so beloved that they became a symbol of prosperity. In season, fresh figs piled high in market stalls, their split skins glistening like jewels. But their magic lay in how they transformed with time. Dried in the sun or pressed into dense cakes, figs became winter sustenance, a burst of summer sugar when the trees stood bare. Soldiers stuffed them into marching packs alongside hardtack, knowing these wrinkled nuggets wouldn't spoil. Horace wrote of nibbling figs while composing poetry, and Pliny marveled at their ability to soothe cough's proof that for Romans, food was never just food. Even the poor could forage wild figs, though the choicest varieties, like the honeyed Ficus carica, graced only the tables of the elite. Grapes, too, straddled worlds. Crushed into wine, they fueled empires, but eaten fresh, they were simple pleasures. Children plucked them from vines trailing over courtyard walls, while laborers tucked clusters into cloth bundles for midday breaks. In autumn, the air in Campania thickened with the scent of grapes, drying into raisins, a process so vital that farmers guarded their racks from thieves and birds alike. Raisins, along with nuts, became the original trail mix, carried by messengers and merchants who needed energy on the move. Archaeologists have found grape seeds in the barracks of Hadrian's Wall, a sweet reminder of home for soldiers shivering in Britannia's chill. Then there were apples, crisp and tart, their popularity immortalized in frescoes at Pompeii. Unlike figs, apples could be stored for months in cool cellars, making them a rare bridge between harvests. Cotto advised wrapping them in fig leaves to prevent bruising, an ancient hack for food preservation. But the real surprise, Romans didn't just eat them raw. They baked apples with honey, stewed them with cumin for savory dishes, and even fermented them into cider in regions too cold for vineyards. An apple might seem ordinary today, but in a world without global shipping, its arrival marked the turning of seasons. Nuts were the ultimate Roman convenience, food. Almonds, walnuts, and chestnuts crammed into sacks or ground into pastes. Street vendors roasted them with salt, selling handfuls to theatergoers much like modern peanuts at a ball game. Legionaries relied on them too. Nut meats packed more energy per ounce than grain, crucial for long marches. Almonds, in particular, were status symbols. Wealthy hosts passed silver bowls of them at parties, while medical texts praised their digestive benefits. But the humblest nut, the acorn, was a fallback in famines, soaked to remove bitterness, then pounded into flour when wheat stores ran low. What's striking is how these foods mirrored Rome's contradictions. Figs and grapes symbolized abundance, yet their dried forms staved off scarcity. Nuts were both snack and survival ration. And apples, they carried the hope of preservation in a world where most food spoiled within days. For all the empire's grandeur, its people clung to these small, sweet victories, proof that even in ancient Rome, joy often came wrapped in a fig leaf or tucked inside a walnut shell. Eggs were the quiet champions of Roman kitchens, cheap, versatile, and packed with protein in a world where meat was a rare indulgence. Unlike delicate spices or imported delicacies, eggs came from backyard chickens, ducks, or geese, making them accessible to everyone from senators to street vendors. The wealthiest might enjoy ostrich eggs, boiled and served in silver stands as dinner party curiosities. But for most Romans, the humble hen's egg was a daily staple. Cracked into sizzling pans for quick meals, whipped into creamy patinée, or hard-boiled and sold by roadside hawkers, eggs bridge the gap between austerity and indulgence. Take the patina, Rome's answer to the modern frittata. Apicius, the legendary gourmet, recorded recipes that transformed eggs into savory custards studded with leftovers, chopped fish, mushrooms, even leftover pulses. These dishes weren't just practical, they were alchemy. A few eggs could stretch scant ingredients into a meal fit for a family, their richness elevating humble vegetables or scraps of meat. One recipe, patina de Pyrrhus, even dared to pair eggs with pears and honey, a sweet and savory experiment that would feel avant-garde today. The technique was simple. Beat eggs with a splash of milk or garum, pour over ingredients in an earthenware dish, and bake near the hearth until set. The result, a dish equally at home in a cramped apartment or a country villa. Street vendors exploited eggs' convenience with flair. At dawn, workers gulped down over spherica, soft boiled eggs cracked straight into the mouth from their shells, a sort of ancient protein shot. Others preferred over frictilia, eggs fried in olive oil and dusted with pepper, wrapped in flatbread for an on-the-go breakfast. Pompeii's ruins reveal carbonized eggshells near Thermopolia, the Roman equivalent of fast food counters, where cooks would have whipped up egg dishes alongside steaming pots of stew. The poet Martial quipped about a tavern keeper who reused eggshells to scam customers, proof that even this basic food could spark shady schemes. What's fascinating is how eggs defied class boundaries. A wealthy host might serve over a paella, eggs poached in wine and garum, garnished with fresh herbs. Meanwhile, a laborer's lunch could be over rustica, eggs scrambled with whatever greens grew wild nearby, seasoned with a pinch of salt from his dole. Yet both meals shared the same humble origin. Eggs were democracy on a plate, their simplicity allowing for endless reinvention. Apicius' most surprising egg trick. Using them as thickeners, his recipes instructed cooks to bind sauces with beaten yolks, a technique still used in modern hollandaise or carbonara. Even more inventive was over spongia ex lacti, a sweet custard puff baked with honey Rome's distant ancestor of the soufflé. These weren't just recipes, they were lessons in resourcefulness, showing how a common ingredient could morph into luxury with a bit of creativity. So next time you fry an egg or fold one into a cake batter, remember, you're channeling Roman ingenuity. 2,000 years ago, someone stood over a smoky hearth, whisking eggs with garum instead of salt, but with the same satisfaction, transforming the ordinary into something sustaining, even extraordinary. In a world without refrigeration or supermarkets, eggs weren't just food, they were a tiny revolution, cracked open daily. The scent of cumin and coriander would have clung to the air of every Roman kitchen, from smoky tenement hearths to countryside farmsteads. Forget the myth that Rome's tables groaned with exotic spices, while the elite imported pepper from India or silphium from Libya. Ordinary people relied on herbs grown in their own gardens or gathered from nearby fields. Cumin, with its earthy warmth, was the workhorse of Roman flavoring, tossed into everything from bread dough to lentil stews. Archaeologists have found cumin seeds in the ruins of soldiers' barracks, tucked into tiny pouches alongside personal effects, proof that this humble spice was as essential as a dagger or a cloak. Coriander, too, was a staple, its citrusy brightness cutting through the heaviness of bean dishes or preserved meats. But here's the twist. Romans didn't just use the seeds. They chopped the fresh leaves into sauces, steeped the roots in vinegar, and even believed the plant could ward off fevers. Pliny the Elder swore by coriander tea for indigestion, while cooks valued it as a cheap alternative to costly imports. Unlike saffron or cinnamon, which traveled thousands of miles on perilous trade routes, coriander could flourish in a clay pot on a windowsill, making it a democratic flavor, available to anyone with a patch of dirt and a little patience. Then there's garum, Rome's secret weapon for turning bland grains into something unforgettable. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of soy sauce or Worcestershire, a fermented punch of umami that transformed even the simplest meal. While the wealthy drizzled top quality garum over oysters, the poor made do with the murky liquamen scraped from the bottom of fermentation vats. But here's what's fascinating. Garum wasn't just a taste enhancer, it was a preservative. Its high salt content kept foods from spoiling, a crucial trick in a world without refrigeration. Soldiers marching through Germania carried dried meat dipped in garum, knowing it would last weeks without rotting. Tavern keepers tossed it into stews to mask the taste of aging vegetables or questionable meat. Even bakers brushed it on bread for extra savoriness, a far cry from today's buttered toast. The real genius of Roman seasoning lay in its practicality. Without modern refrigeration, herbs like thyme and oregano didn't just add flavor, they fought bacteria. Rosemary sprigs tucked into storage, jars kept weevils out of grain. Fennel seeds chewed after meals freshened breath and settled stomachs. And garum. It was the ultimate multitasker, seasoning, preservative, and even medicine, with doctors prescribing it for everything from dog bites to diarrhea. So next time you sprinkle cumin into a stew or reach for fish sauce in a recipe, you're touching a thread that stretches back to Roman hands grinding herbs in stone mortars. These weren't just flavors, they were ingenuity distilled into scent and taste, a way to make scarcity feel abundant, and the ordinary extraordinary. The streets of ancient Rome hummed with the sizzle and steam of thermopolia, the empire's answer to fast food. These bustling counters, their brick ovens glowing with coals, were the lifeblood of workers who couldn't afford kitchens of their own. Picture a carpenter, his tunic dusted with marble chips, jostling for space at a counter as a vendor slaps a flatbread onto a griddle, topping it with leftover stew or a smear of garlic paste. This wasn't just convenience, it was necessity. For a few bronze coins, you could grab a steaming bowl of poles for butter, a thick chickpea stew flavored with leeks and a splash of garum, or a skewer of lukaniki, fatty sausages spiced with pepper and pine nuts, their casings snapping with each bite. The aromas alone were a marketing strategy, luring in customers with the promise of warmth and fullness after a long day hauling amphorae or scrubbing floors. One dish, though, stands out as a culinary ancestor. Placenta, no, not the modern medical term. This was a layered flatbread smeared with cheese and honey, baked until crisp at the edges. Folded in half, it became a portable meal, a distant cousin to today's pizza by the slice. Archaeologists excavating Pompeii's thermopolia have found counters stained with traces of olive oil and charred dough, their surfaces worn smooth by thousands of hands grabbing quick meal. The poet Martial even griped about a tavern keeper who reused yesterday's bread as today's crust, proof that some fast food scams are as old as time. What's fascinating isn't just the food itself, but who ate it. Thermopolia were egalitarian spaces. A senator might never set foot in one, but his enslaved secretary or the mason building his villa relied on them daily. The wealthy sneered at these vulgar eateries, yet their own kitchens likely borrowed the same flavors, that chickpea stew, It mirrored the refined pulse served at patrician tables, just without the expensive spices or fancy plating. Even Rome's infamous fish sauce, garum, bridged the divide watered down for the poor, aged to perfection for the elite. The real legacy of Roman street food lies in its endurance. Those sizzling sausages evolved into the salami of Italy, while the humble flatbread dressed up with tomatoes centuries later became pizza. But perhaps the most telling detail comes from Herculaneum, where a Thermopolium's fresco still shows a laughing vendor handing a customer a loaf. 2,000 years later, the ritual's the same, quick, hot, and deeply human. No matter the era, hunger doesn't wait, and neither does good food. Stepping into a Roman tavern was like diving headfirst into the empire's beating heart, noisy, crowded, and alive with the clatter of cups and the stench of cheap wine. These weren't the refined dining rooms of the elite. Popini were where laborers, freedmen, and soldiers went to trade gossip, gamble with dice, and drown the day's aches in a bowl of steaming stew. The philosopher Seneca sneered at them as dens of vice, but for Rome's working class, they were lifelines. Picture a dim room lit by flickering oil lamps, its walls stained with smoke, where a single copper coin could buy you a slab of boiled pork, swimming in garum, or a clay cup of vinegary wine cut with water. No menus, no fuss. Just rough wooden counters piled with whatever the cook had thrown into the pot that morning. The food was hearty, if not elegant. Tavern keepers thrived on scraps and ingenuity, simmering tough cuts of meat for hours with lentils and turnips, until they surrendered into something edible. One popular dish, offally, was little more than charred chunks of mutton or goat, salted to hide the taste of aging flesh. Adventurous eaters might try a sisha, patties of minced meat mixed with breadcrumbs and pine nuts, an ancient ancestor of the burger. But the real star was sola catabia, a slapdash salad of stale bread soaked in vinegar, tossed with whatever greens were cheapest that day, and crowned with a single oily sardine if you were lucky. This wasn't cuisine, it was survival, served hot and fast to men who needed calories more than flavor. Drink, though, was the true currency of the popina. Forget the fine Falernian wine sipped by senators. Tavern wine was vinum crudum, raw and harsh, often doctored with honey to mask its sourness or worse, laced with lead to sweeten it fraudulently. Some vendors stretched their stock by adding seawater or herbs. A trick marshal mocked in his epigrams. "What's this, innkeeper? Your wine smells like a fisherman's net." Yet for all the complaints, the wine flowed freely, fueling raucous debates over chariot races, bawdy songs, and the occasional brawl. Taverns were where politics got personal. A drunk carpenter might rant about the grain dole's shortcomings, while a retired legionary grumbled about back pay. No wonder emperors kept spies posted in these rooms, ears tuned for whispers of unrest. The popina's reputation as a den of debauchery wasn't entirely unfair. Gambling was rampant, despite laws banning dice games outside of festivals. Prostitutes loitered near the doorways, and graffiti from Pompeii's tavern walls boasts of stolen kisses and unpaid tabs. But to dismiss these spaces as mere vice pits misses their deeper role. For enslaved workers, barred from formal gatherings, taverns offered fleeting freedom, a place to speak without a master's oversight. For immigrants from Gaul or Syria, they were pockets of home, where foreign spices might scent the stew and familiar languages filled the air. And for Rome's invisible millions, the porters, weavers, and ditch diggers, they were the closest thing to a dining room they'd ever have. What's striking is how little separates these ancient haunts from today's dive bars or workers' cafes. The same clatter of laughter, the same swirl of grease and gossip, the same desperate, joyful need to carve out a space where life's edges soften, if only for an hour. The wealthy might dine on silver platters, but history remembers the Poppiner's sticky counters and scorched stews just as vividly, proof that civilization isn't built only in marble forums, but in smoky back rooms where the wine is bad, the jokes are crude, and the food, against all odds, feels like home. Without refrigerators or vacuum-sealed packaging, Roman cooks relied on age-old tricks to keep food from spoiling, methods so effective we still use them today. Salt was the ultimate weapon against decay. Fishermen along the coast tossed their catch into barrels layered with coarse salt, pressing it down until the fish released their moisture and transformed into a preserved mass. This wasn't delicate table salt. It was rough, unrefined stuff mined from places like Ostia, gritty enough to scour pots, but perfect for drawing out bacteria-friendly water. Even the poorest family could salt down a handful of olives or pack fresh herbs in salt to stretch their shelf life from days to months. The result? Dishes like salsamentum, fish or meat cured in salt so thoroughly it had to be soaked for hours before eating. A far cry from today's quick-cured delicacies. Smoke worked where salt ran short. In countryside farms, hams and sausages dangled over smouldering fruitwood fires for weeks, the creosote in the smoke acting as a natural preservative. Archaeologists have found sooty hooks in Pompeian kitchens, evidence of home-scale smoking that turned cheap cuts into long-lasting protein. Soldiers marching through Germania carried botulinum, smoked sausages stuffed with offal and grain-clumsy ancestors of modern salami. But smoking wasn't just for meat. Hard cheeses like Cassius fumacis absorbed smoke's tang, their rinds becoming nearly impervious to mold. A single wheel could last through winter, shaved thin over bread or stews when fresh milk was a distant memory. Then there was fermentation, Rome's most ingenious preservation hack. Olives, too bitter to eat fresh, were buried in jars of salty brine, where microbes transformed their flesh into something rich and edible. Garum, that infamous fish sauce, was essentially controlled rot layers of anchovies and salt left to liquefy in the sun, their enzymes breaking down proteins into savory umami. Even vegetables weren't safe from the process. Cabbage, packed into clay pots with vinegar and herbs, became a primitive sauerkraut, its tang cutting through the monotony of winter meals. Drying was the simplest method of all. Figs, grapes, and plums shriveled on reed mats under the summer sun, their sugars concentrating into dense, chewy fuel. Workers tied strings of dried apples and pears to their belts for midday snacks, while legionaries marched on rations of bucillotum, rock-hard bread baked twice to drive out every drop of moisture. The wealthy might enjoy honeyed dates from Syria, but the poor made do with wild berries strung on threads and hung from rafters nature's candy, preserved by nothing more than air and time. What's striking is how these techniques shaped Roman eating habits. A summer glut of peaches meant peach leather rolled into scrolls for winter, a bumper crop of turnips. Sliced thin and dried into chips, nothing was wasted because waste could mean hunger when frost killed the fields. Even wine, usually fermented for drinking, was boiled down into soppa, a syrupy preservative used to coat fruits or cure meats. Preservation wasn't just a chore. It was a rhythm as natural as planting or harvest, stitching the seasons together one salted, smoked, or soaked bite at a time. The real genius lay in accessibility. Unlike exotic spices or imported delicacies, these methods required no wealth, just knowledge. A child could gather herbs to dry. A widow could brine olives in a cracked jar. A shepherd could smoke cheese over his evening fire. In a world where fresh food spoiled by noon, preservation was power, the quiet, daily defiance of time itself. So next time you sprinkle salt on a meal or bite into a smoked almond, remember you're part of a chain stretching back to Roman hands, turning scarcity into abundance with nothing but patience and ingenuity. Rome's stomach and the empire's bounty weren't the same thing. While the capital gorged on shipments of Egyptian grain and Spanish olive oil, rural Italy clung to old ways. Farmers still planted their ancestors' crops in the same rocky soil. Walk into a countryside kitchen in Samnium or Etruria, and you'd find storage jars brimming with spelt from the nearest field, honey from local hives, and cheese made from sheep that grazed visible hills. This wasn't just tradition, it was defiance. The poet Columella grumbled about stubborn peasants who refused to adopt Roman wheat, preferring their hardy emmer even if it yielded less. But here's what he missed. That emmer didn't need costly transport or imperial bureaucrats to arrive. It grew where it was sown, surviving droughts that left city dwellers begging for grain ships. Cross the Alps into Gaul, and the gap widened. Roman settlers built villas with sprawling wheat fields, yet Celtic villages still foraged for acorns and hunted boar. Archaeologists find Roman-style mills in Gallic towns, proof some adopted the empire's carbs, but their trash pits tell another story. Alongside broken amphorae of imported wine lie bones from deer and wild fowl, suggesting Roman rule didn't erase centuries of forest-fed diets overnight. The real tension flared in Britain, where Celtic tribes saw bread as an insult. Tacitus recorded their chiefs mocking Roman soldiers as slaves to wheat, weak men who couldn't stomach real food, meat, milk, and barley beer. When Boudicca's rebels sacked Roman settlements, they targeted granaries first, torching the symbol of an alien way of life. Yet provinces weren't just resisting, they were adapting. In North Africa, Berber herders kept their flocks, but sold wool to Roman cities, then bought back olive oil pressed from their own trees, now tended by Roman agronomists. Syria's farmers grafted Roman apple cuttings onto native trees, creating hybrids that thrived in both worlds. Even German tribes, who famously spurned Roman agriculture, buried their dead with Roman-style drinking cups, a small concession to imperial taste. The empire's true culinary legacy wasn't uniformity, but layers. A legionary garrisoned in Judea might crave his mother's lentil stew, but he'd also develop a taste for dates and sesame. A Gaulish potter could bake Roman-style bread, yet still lace it with local herbs. Rome didn't erase regional diets. It tangled them into something new, proof that conquest doesn't always happen on battlefields, but in the quiet acts of grinding grain, fermenting grapes, and deciding, bite by bite, what to keep and what to chain. For Roman farmers, the turning of the seasons wasn't just about weather. It was a relentless countdown to hunger or plenty. Spring meant tender greens and the first eggs from scrawny chickens, while summer brought figs so ripe they burst at a touch. But autumn was the true test of survival. Every grape harvested, every olive shaken from the trees had to stretch through months when the earth lay barren. Imagine a peasant family in Latium, watching the last apples disappear from their storage pit by midwinter, knowing the next fresh fruit wouldn't come until the cherry blossoms fell. This wasn't poetic nostalgia, it was mathematics. A miscalculation in how much grain to set aside, or a few missed days salting fish, could mean empty bellies by February. Winter transformed meals into acts of ingenuity. Smokehouses hummed with activity as hams cured over juniper fires, while clay jars of fermented cabbage roams answered to sauerkraut-lined cellar walls. Bread wasn't baked daily, but in massive batches. The loaves twice baked into tooth-breaking panis militaris that could last for weeks. Even wine changed character, watered down and spiced with honey to stretch dwindling stores. The poet Ovid captured the irony. During Saturnalia, Rome's riotous December festival, masters served slaves the same dried figs and nuts the poor would gnaw on grimly come January. The difference, Saturnalia's excess was play acting, a temporary reversal of roles. Once the festivities ended, the real hierarchy of hunger returned. What's fascinating is how deeply food preservation shaped Rome's calendar. The February Feri Sementivi wasn't just a sowing festival. It was a plea to the gods to protect the seeds that would determine next winter's survival. Families blessed their storage jars at the Consuelia in August, knowing those very vessels would soon hold life-saving pulses and grains. Even the wealthy, insulated by their granaries, couldn't escape nature's rhythm. Pliny the Younger wrote of his Tuscan villa's cellar, groaning with last autumn's bounty, a boast that revealed his privilege, but also his dependence on the same cycles that governed the poorest farmer. Saturnalia's feasts masked this harsh reality with theatrical abundance. For a few days, wax candles replaced sunlight, and even the humblest could pretend scarcity didn't exist. Tables groaned with dormice stuffed with nuts, a luxury few could afford year-round, and honey cakes shaped like temples. But the holiday's true purpose was psychological, a pressure valve for a society where hunger lurked constantly. When Seneca criticized Saturnalia's excesses, he missed the point. These weren't just parties, but collective exhales before the long tighten of belts. The real genius of Roman seasonal eating lay in its flexibility. A bad olive harvest meant more smoked cheese. A glut of pears led to experiments in drying them into leather. Every meal was a negotiation with the land, a reminder that nature's calendar couldn't be bullied, only adapted to. Today, when we buy strawberries in December or ship grapes across hemispheres, we've lost something vital. The intimate, sometimes brutal dialogue between soil and survival that shaped every bite in ancient Rome. Their menus weren't curated. They were conquered, wrested from the earth with toil, stored with care, and seasoned with the sharpest spice of all, necessity. Every Roman kitchen doubled as a shrine. Tucked in a corner or perched above the hearth, small figurines of the lair's household gods stood watch over meals. These weren't distant deities demanding grand sacrifices. They were intimate guardians, content with crumbs and whispered thanks. The simplest offering. A mola salsa, a cake of coarse flour mixed with salt and sprinkled on the hearth. No lavish ingredients, no elaborate rituals, just a humble gesture to ensure the next loaf wouldn't burn or the olive harvest wouldn't fail. Archaeologists have found tiny clay altars in Pompeii's cramped apartments, their surfaces still stained with oil and grain residues, proof that even the poorest families carved out space for the divine in their daily hunger. Public sacrifices couldn't have been more different. When a consul vowed a hecatomb, 100 oxen slaughtered for Jupiter, the streets near the Capitolium ran red with blood. The gods got the fat-wrapped entrails, but the real prize was the meat. After the priests took their cut, the rest was parceled out to citizens, a rare windfall of protein in a city where fresh beef was a luxury. The poet Juvenal captured the chaos, hungry crowds jostling for portions, some leaving with haunches, others with mere scraps of gristle. These distributions weren't just about feeding people. They were political theater. Emperors like Augustus knew full well that a well-timed sacrifice could quell murmurs of discontent faster than a troop of soldiers. Yet the contrast between household and state rituals reveals a deeper truth about Roman spirituality. The lairs demanded austerity, salted flour, a handful of fruit because they were family. Their offerings mirrored the meals of those who worshipped them, plain, practical, rooted in the earth. Jupiter's feasts, though, were spectacles of excess, designed to awe as much as to nourish. A peasant might offer his lares the first bite of a modest bean stew, trusting they'd understand its significance. The state, meanwhile, roasted whole bulls to remind everyone who held the reins of power and who controlled the food supply. The sacred seeped into secular meals, too. No Roman would dream of dining without a libation, a splash of wine poured for the gods before the first sip. Even street vendors murmured prayers over their sizzling sausages, tossing a bite into the fire for luck. What's striking isn't just the ritual, but the intimacy of it. The gods weren't abstract concepts. They were silent dinner guests, their presence as natural as the olive oil pooling at the bottom of a dish. So the next time you sprinkle salt on your food or raise a glass in toast, remember, you're echoing gestures older than empires. The lares may be forgotten, but their legacy lingers in every small act of gratitude, the quiet understanding that sustenance, whether a crust of bread or a feast fit for Jupiter, is never just food. It's a contract between the mortal and the divine, sealed with flour, smoke, and the hope that tomorrow there will be enough. Cotto the elder didn't mince words when it came to feeding enslaved workers. Give them bread made from the cheapest wheat, olives that have fallen from the tree, and wine that's gone sour. This wasn't just frugality. It was calculated deprivation. The rations prescribed by Rome's most notorious farm manual, De Agricultura, read like a recipe for survival at its barest edge. Slaves grinding grain in country mills or laboring under the Mediterranean sun received just enough to keep their bodies functional, not thriving. Their daily bread wasn't the coarse panis plebeius of free citizens, but panis serviles, a dense loaf bulked with bran, chaff, and occasionally even sawdust when harvests were lean. Archaeologists analyzing dental remains from rural villas have found teeth worn down to the roots, a silent testament to years chewing gritty, unrefined flour. Olives, a staple for most Romans, became a cruel irony for the enslaved. While the wealthy drizzled first-press oil over delicacies, field hands were given the fruit that even pigs might reject overripe, bruised or scavenged from the ground. These weren't the plump, brine-cured olives of city markets, but bitter, barely edible orbs, often soaked in vinegar to mask rot. And wine, what little they received was laura, a pathetic brew made by soaking the leftover grape skins and stems in water after the good wine had been pressed twice for their enslavers. It was little more than flavored water, its alcohol content negligible, its taste like vinegar laced with dirt. Yet even this meager diet had hierarchies. House slaves in urban mansions might snatch scraps from their masters' tables, a chicken bone to gnaw on, a dab of honeyed porridge, while miners in Spain or rowers on warships faced starvation rations. Cotto advised varying food by workload. A chainsmith could have an extra handful of beans, but a field hand breaking rocks got only enough to keep their muscles moving. The philosopher Seneca, with chilling pragmatism, compared feeding slaves to maintaining tools. You oil a plow before storing it. You give a slave just enough so it doesn't rust from disuse. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical. Roman writers joked about slaves stealing food or faking illness to rest. But these weren't just lazy stereotypes. They were acts of quiet resistance in a system designed to break bodies and spirits. A graffiti from Pompey's slave quarters scratches out a plea. May the one who steals my bread choke on it. Hunger wasn't just scarcity, it was weaponized control. What's rarely acknowledged is how these rations shaped Rome's economy. An enslaved worker fed on moldy olives and sour wine cost less to maintain than a draft animal, making human labor disturbingly disposable. Yet even within this brutality, ingenuity flickered. Archaeologists have found tiny garden plots near slave barracks, where workers grew onions or bitter greens to supplement their meals. Fish bones mixed into the waste pits of rural estates suggest some risked punishment to set traps in nearby streams. These weren't just survival tactics, they were silent declarations of humanity in a world determined to erase it. So when we read Cotto's cold calculations or Seneca's callous metaphors, we're not just seeing ancient frugality, we're witnessing the blueprint of an empire built on millions of empty stomachs, where every stale crust and rancid olive was a measurement of power. The true legacy of Rome's enslaved diets isn't in what was given, but in what was stolen. Not just food, but dignity, health, and sometimes the very will to live. The miracle isn't that they survived, but that they found ways, however small, to resist being reduced to mere tools in their master's ledgers. A Roman child's first taste of solid food wasn't fruit or honey, it was pulse. A bland mush of flour and goat's milk spooned into their mouths by mothers or wet nurses. This unremarkable pap, thin enough to swallow but hearty enough to stick to tiny ribs, was the bridge between breast milk and bread. The physician Soranus prescribed precise ratios: 2 parts milk to 1 part finely ground spelt, simmered until it clung to a finger without dripping. Too thick and it could choke an infant, too thin and it wouldn't stave off hunger. Wealthier families might sweeten it with a dab of honey or rose water, but for most, it was sheer necessity. A way to free mothers for work in the fields or loom while keeping babies fed. Archaeologists have found miniature pottery feeding bottles in graves, their spouts designed to let infants suckle porridge directly. A poignant reminder of how early Roman lives were shaped by practicality. As toddlers wobbled on unsteady legs, their diets expanded to include globe-eye-round balls of fried dough, drizzled with honey or crushed nuts, sold by street vendors near playgrounds and baths. These greasy, sticky treats were the ancient equivalent of cereal puffs or teething biscuits, easy for small hands to grasp and gnaw. Parents also relied on soft fruits like figs or stewed apples, mashed between fingers before being offered to fussy eaters. Marshall joked about a child smearing more fig pulp on their face than into their mouth, while medical texts warned against overindulgence in sweets, fearing it would spoil a child's appetite for proper food like bread and porridge. But childhood wasn't all simple snacks. The transition to adult fare came early and brutally. By 5 or 6, poor children joined their parents in scraping meals together, chewing on hard bread crusts, sipping watered-down wine, and swallowing bitter greens foraged from roadsides. Grave goods tell haunting stories. Small skeletons buried with carefully placed eggs or walnuts, symbols of a life cut short before they could taste the richness of adulthood. In Ostia, a toddler's grave held a tiny clay bowl, still holding petrified remains of lentils. A final offering from grieving parents who hoped their child wouldn't hunger in the afterlife. For the privileged few, mealtimes carried different rituals. Wealthy boys and girls dined on finely milled bread, fresh cheeses, and even small portions of roasted meat, their diets monitored by tutors who believed food shaped both body and character. Plutarch argued that overfeeding children made them sluggish, while too much spice inflamed tempers. Yet even these children faced grim realities. Medical scrolls describe remedies for worms, a common affliction from contaminated food, and instructions for treating rickets, a bone disease caused by malnutrition. The most heartbreaking glimpse into Roman childhood comes from depictions. Cursed tablets pleading with the gods to save ailing babies. One, scratched onto lead in shaky letters, begs, "Let this child keep down his milk, let him not vomit, let him grow strong." Behind the grand narratives of empire and conquest, these whispers endure, of parents grinding flour into pap, of tiny hands clutching honeyed dough, of love measured in mouthfuls and memories. To eat like a Roman child was to navigate a world where every meal carried the weight of survival, where even the simplest bite could be a promise or a farewell. A Roman legionary on the march carried his kitchen on his back, not pots and pans, but a simple leather pouch bulging with rock-hard biscuits and a flask of sour wine. This was the fuel that built an empire, bite by relentless bite. The staple of every soldier's diet was bucillotum, a twice-baked wheat cracker so durable it could break teeth. Archaeological digs along Hadrian's Wall have uncovered these fossilized discs, still intact after 2 millennia, their edges gnawed by desperate jaws. Soldiers softened them in watered-down vinegar or grated them into stews, turning what was essentially edible plaster into something resembling food. But here's the twist. This wasn't just poor nutrition, it was logistical genius. Those indestructible crackers could last for months, unaffected by rain, heat, or the pests that ruined softer bread. An army's strength wasn't just in its swords, but in the resilience of its rations. Then there was laridum, salt-cured bacon, that became the protein backbone of conquest. Each legionary received about half a pound of it weekly, thick slabs of pork belly packed in salt, smoked over oak fires until it resembled leather. Unlike fresh meat, which spoiled within days, laridum could endure weeks in a marching pack. Soldiers roasted it over campfires, letting the fat drip onto their bucillotum to add much-needed calories. The historian Polybius described how a single slice, boiled with lentils or chickpeas, transformed into a meal capable of sustaining men through 20-mile marches in full armor. But the real secret wasn't just preservation, it was psychology. The smell of sizzling bacon carried home on the wind, a visceral reminder of the farms and families left behind. Even on the barbarian frontiers, that scent was a tether to Rome. Garum, the infamous fish sauce, played a role no modern condiment could match. Legionaries received it in small clay bottles, its briny punch serving multiple purposes, flavoring bland grain porridge, preserving scavenged meat, and even disinfecting wounds when medical supplies ran low. Archaeologists have found garum stains on cooking pots in German battlefield camps, proof that this pungent liquid followed Rome's eagles into the wilderness. But its most vital function was hydration. Mixed with water and vinegar, garum became posca, a gritty, electrolyte-rich drink that warded off dehydration during grueling campaigns. The acidic brew killed waterborne pathogens, making it safer than straight river water, a fact not lost on generals who knew dysentery could cripple an army faster than enemy spears. The real marvel of Roman military rations wasn't their taste. It was their scalability. A single mule could carry enough bucillotum and laridum to feed a century for days, while garum's concentrated umami meant a few drops could transform forage into something edible. When Julius Caesar's forces besieged Alesia, their ability to subsist on scant rations while Gauls starved decided the battle. And when Trajan's legions crossed the scorching Syrian desert, it was vinegar-infused water and crushed grain that kept them moving. These weren't meals, they were tactical assets, as crucial as shields or sandals. Yet for all its efficiency, the system had cracks. Soldiers stationed in Egypt complained of weevil-infested flour, while those in Britannia traded with locals for fresh meat when laridum ran foul. Tombstones along the Danube tell silent stories, teenage recruits dead from malnutrition, their bones stunted by years of meager camp fare. The poet Juvenal sneered at veterans who dreamed of civilian bread, their palates ruined by a decade of hardtack and garum. But these very rations, brutal as they were, underwrote Rome's dominion. Every conquest, from the olive groves of Hispania to the wheat fields of Dacia, was carved by men who marched on empty stomachs and fought with the ghost of hunger at their backs. So next time you see a Roman soldier in film lounging at a banquet, remember the truth. The empire wasn't won on roasted goose or honeyed wine, but on the iron will of men who chewed their salt pork silently in the rain, their faces lit by campfires flickering at the edge of the known world. Their real weapon wasn't the gladius, it was the relentless, unglamorous discipline of turning rock-hard bread and rancid fish sauce into an unstoppable force. Hunger was the spectre that haunted Rome's crowded streets, a force more feared than barbarian armies or crumbling aqueducts. When grain ships from Egypt or Sicily stalled in windless seas or fell prey to pirates, the city's pulse turned frantic. Bakeries emptied within hours. Mobs formed at the state granaries, their desperation turning to violence as families clutched empty sacks. Emperors knew the stakes. A hungry Rome was a Rome, one failed harvest away from rebellion. Nero, infamously, exploited this vulnerability with chilling precision during the Great Fire of 64 AD. While flames devoured neighborhoods, rumors swirled that he'd ordered grain shipments diverted to his private estates, leaving the people to starve amid the ashes. Whether true or not, the damage was done. His golden house rose while stomachs growled a misstep that would echo in his eventual downfall. Price gouging turned scarcity into suffering. A Pompeian graffiti scrawled on a bakery wall snarls, "The loaves grow smaller, the coins letter. Thieving bakers, may Cerberus gnaw your guts." This wasn't just frustration. It was a snapshot of an empire-wide crisis. Grain merchants, smelling profit in desperation, hoarded supplies until prices tripled. Middlemen diluted flour with chalk or sawdust, a practice so rampant that officials stamped genuine loaves with produce approved to reassure buyers. But when even stamped bread grew scarce, the plebs turned their anger upward. The historian Tacitus recounts riots where crowds hurled rocks at equestrians caught smuggling sacks of wheat to their villas, their greed laid bare by the hunger around them. The emperor's responses oscillated between spectacle and brutality. Augustus, ever the strategist, created the annona system state, subsidized grain doles to placate the masses. But later rulers like Commodus weaponized hunger, withholding distributions to punish political opponents or cities that defied him. During the year of the 5 emperors, grain became a bargaining chip. Armies loyal to rival claimants seized ports and burned fields, knowing starvation would break resistance faster than sword. In Antioch, when a governor tried to stabilize prices by capping them, merchants simply stopped selling. The resulting famine left families grinding acorns into flour, a last resort when even the rats had been eaten. Archaeology offers grim corroboration. Soil layers in Roman ports reveal spikes in lead pollution during famines, evidence of frantic smelting to mint emergency coins for grain purchases. Skeletal studies show children with stunted growth and teeth pitted by malnutrition, their bones whispering of winters when the storerooms stood empty. Even Pompeii's ashes preserve tragedy. A cellar crammed with skeletons, their hands clutching empty bowls, trapped not by lava, but by hunger's slow chokehold. Yet amid the desperation, flashes of solidarity flickered. Guilds pooled resources to feed members' families. Neighbors traded heirloom jewelry for a single sack of barley. And in the darkest hours, the empire's neglected corners, wild garlic gathered from roadsides, nettle stews brewed in dented pots, became testaments to resilience. Hunger didn't just expose Rome's fractures. It revealed the tenacity of those who refused to vanish quietly into history's margins. When the grain ships finally returned, it wasn't the emperor's statues they thanked, but the stubborn will to survive another day. The ghost of ancient Rome lingers in kitchens around the world, not in marble counters or gilded feasts, but in the quiet persistence of everyday flavors. Take garum, that pungent fish sauce Romans splashed on everything from lentils to desserts. Today it whispers through Vietnamese nuoc mam, Thai nam pla, and even Worcestershire sauce, all descendants of that same fermented alchemy. The difference, while Roman elites prized garum aged for years in glass jars, modern fish sauces capture its essence without the imperial price tag. Walk into any Southeast Asian market, and you'll find shelves lined with plastic bottles of amber liquid, each carrying traces of a recipe first stirred in Pompeii's vats. Food historian Sally Granger notes that Roman garum traders would have recognized the process instantly. Layer fish with salt, let time work its magic, strain the golden elixir. 2,000 years later, the umami punch remains unchanged. Then there's pulse, the humble porridge that fueled legionaries and laborers. In northern Italy, it evolved into polenta corsa, yes, but still that same comforting mash of simmered grain. The key shift, corn, a New World import, replaced spelt and millet. Yet the soul of the dish endures, a golden steaming bowl that transforms with a drizzle of olive oil or a crumbling of cheese, just as it did in Roman field kitchens. Even the cooking method, slow stirring in a copper pot, echoes Apicius' advice to never let the poles rest, lest it clump. But for every genuine legacy, there's a myth begging to be debunked. Hollywood loves painting Roman feasts as orgiastic free-for-alls with stuffed dormice and vomitoriums, a word that actually refers to passageways, not purging. In truth, most Romans ate like Apicius' recipe for lentils with coriander, simple, hearty, and thrifty. The infamous dormice, a rare delicacy for bored elites, not some everyday snack. As for reclining banquets, they were status symbols, not the norm. The average Roman dined on a stool, balancing a bowl of stew on their knees. The real Roman culinary revolution wasn't decadence, it was logistics. Their genius lay in preserving flavors across an empire. Olive oil shipped in uniform amphorae, grain doles standardized across provinces, garum factories scaling production for millions. Modern food corporations owe more to Rome's systematized trade routes than to any ostentatious banquet. Next time you shake fish sauce onto pad thai or savor polenta's creamy grit, remember you're not just tasting history. You're touching the quiet, practical genius people who knew that feeding an empire required more than spectacle. It demanded flavors that could outlast marble monuments and echo through millennia. The true legacy of ancient Rome's commoners isn't found in marble monuments or imperial decrees. It's etched into the grooves of millstones, the soot of hearth fires, and the stubborn simplicity of meals built to endure. These were diets forged not by choice, but by necessity, pulses that could weather famine, grains that bridged harvests, and flavors wrung from every scrap the earth offered. What's remarkable isn't just what they ate, but what they refused, to let scarcity strip away ingenuity. A handful of lentils became stew with garlic and garum. Acorns, when wheat ran low, were pounded into survival bread. Even the humblest ingredients carried whispers of adaptation: figs dried against winter, cheese smoked to outlast summer's heat. This wasn't subsistence, it was a quiet rebellion. While emperors gorged on stuffed peacocks, the masses turned hardship into tradition. The same chickpea stew bubbling in a Pompeian tenement might have simmered in a legion's camp kettle, or a farmer's pot in distant Gaul, binding empire together not with conquest, but with the universal language of hunger and resourcefulness. Archaeologists trace these threads in carbonized olive pits, in fish bones gnawed clean, in the wear patterns on teeth ground down by coarse flour testaments, to lives measured in mouthfuls. Yet for all their simplicity, these foods outlasted the empire itself. The Roman commoner's kitchen was a laboratory of resilience, where fermentation preserved what salt couldn't, where every herb had a purpose beyond flavor, thyme to ward off spoilage, fennel to soothe aching bellies. When we drizzle olive oil on bread or sprinkle salt into a pot, we're not just cooking, we're echoing motions practiced in dimly lit insuli 2,000 years ago. So here's the challenge: step into their sandals. Would you dare to sip posca that vinegary soldiers drink, or brave a spoonful of garum, the fish sauce that flavored an empire? Maybe you'd prefer the comfort of poles, the porridge that fueled generations. Whatever your choice, remember, these weren't just meals. They were acts of defiance, proof that even in the shadow of palaces, the simplest bite could be a triumph. So tell us, what ancient Roman dish would you try? Drop your pick in the comments, and let's taste history together.